All right, good morning, everybody. It's 9 o'clock, time to begin our class. You'll note on the board my contact information. There is a clarification I need to make note of. My email is not joshushthehut@gmail.com. It's joshuathehut@gmail.com. I made it right after high school. You have to forgive me, but it should be an A instead of an S in there. joshuathehut@gmail.com. Email me, text me with any questions, comments, complaints, or suggestions. If you would, let's bow to our Heavenly Father before we begin class. Dear Heavenly Father, we come before you this morning thankful of all of our blessings, thankful for the opportunity to gather here with our brethren, to open up your word and study from it. We pray that you be with us this morning, that we will purge all worldly thoughts from our minds, that we will focus intently on the subject at hand, and that you will be with us, that we will grow in knowledge and understanding, and we will grow in wisdom and be better able to apply these things to our lives and be the examples we need to be when we depart. Thank you for your mercy and your Son, Jesus. In his name we pray. Amen. It's exceedingly loud. I'm sorry.
That's all right. Go ahead and put it back up. We'll adjust it.
All right. Yeah. All right. But before we dive back into the class, I do want to touch on a clarification from last week. Kind of touched on science a little bit, and sometimes these topics can be like very big and have like a lot of depth, and when you try to cover them briefly, it just creates more confusion than any help. So, not that I want to linger on this too much, but I do think it's worth it's worth touching on, and it's worth the clarification. I was at my parents' congregation in Georgia, I don't know, a couple of months ago, or maybe even longer. I don't know. It's been a while, but a small congregation already, but several people were out of town, so it was even smaller. And so you had a class of everyone. So even the few young children that were there, they didn't have enough to have their class. So just everyone in the auditorium for the class. And the preacher was giving the class, giving the instruction. And he was asking a couple of like leading questions, to make his point. And one of them came, to like science and archaeology, and is like, does science only confirm the Bible? Most people answered yes, and there was just one guy who said no. And it took the teacher kind of aback, and like, it does, and he just moved on. And after the class, after the service, I went up and told my dad, I'm like, I don't think you should move on from that stuff and try to avoid it when things get uncomfortable. I think these are things we need to discuss and talk about. And in that class, neither of those guys were wrong, right? Because the term science is used often to mean different things, right? So here are a couple of definitions of science up here, and I capitalized, natural, physical, material, things like that as they come down, and all these definitions have that in common. Okay, so that's one thing we need to know. Science is basically the method for understanding the natural, physical, material world. When we use the term science in conversation, and not just in conversation, but in literature and other things like too, you'll see this used. So it can mean hard data, the facts, indisputable facts. I've measured this, it is this long. I've weighed this, it is this weight, and things like that and so forth. And so in that class I was talking about, there were a lot of people who were referring to it as that. This hard data does not contradict the Bible. Okay, well, I agree with that. But science also involves a hypothesis. It involves conclusions based on experiments. And we all know, we've read plenty of books where people make a conclusion from certain data. It's like they're making a leap here, but that's what they do. And sometimes, that conclusion or determination might contradict or might not totally align with the Bible. So that's true too. It can also be used to refer to different disciplines, right, of science. So biology, physics, chemistry, all these things are also science. So one of the main things I wanted us to understand was that we need to, when science is used, don't be scared of it, and don't automatically think, it's all bad, or it's all good, or we have to follow only science, right? Because I got my cell phone, it works, therefore science is great. Elon Musk is landing rockets vertically, therefore science is perfect. That's not the case. Science is a tool. It helps us, but not everything that we slap the label science on is like an exact kind of science. It fails. These conclusions are also often wrong. So when it comes up in class, I don't think or especially with young people, and this is something that I maybe worry about. I've got young boys. You can teach children in Bible class all you want. Science only confirms the Bible. Science only confirms the Bible. And you almost hide them from these other conclusions that studied scientists often draw. And then when they leave home, maybe for the first time, and go off to some other place, some secular school, which isn't wrong, you can get good education at these places, but they hear a professor and then the majority of their students who are like, yeah, religion is dumb, science is disproving the Bible, blah, 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 blah. It shakes a surprising number of their faith, and it doesn't need to. And that was one of the things I was wanting to kind of touch on. Again, science is a tool. It's a method to discover the natural physical world. So it is not equipped, really, to address the spiritual, right? So if you say, well, I'm using a metal detector, it doesn't find wood, therefore wood doesn't exist, it's dumb. And we often use science that way too, or some people do. So, the science, there's a natural physical processes, we can't find God there, so therefore God doesn't exist. That's kind of a nonsensical statement, in my opinion. The Bible is not a textbook, it's not written like one, it's not intended to be one. So to compare it to other science books is maybe a little misplaced. And like I'm saying, telling children that science only confirms the Bible without kind of going into these nuances, the differences of things being used, can potentially become confusing. And that's the main thing I want to talk about. We can avoid that. I'd like. For sure.
Like I wrote an article about Jesus and like what he went through during his persecution and like the spear wound. Just for an example, it says blood and water came out. Like we don't really look at that and kind of fully grasp that. But if you were to take a pint of blood and stick it in a glass and sit it on the table, in about 30 minutes, the plasma's going to set to the bottom, and the blood's going to rise.
Yeah.
So that blood and water that came out of him was plasma.
Oh, definitely. I mean, yeah. There are. Yes, I totally agree with you. There are things we can look at and point to, scientifically, they align with science. Yes, I think the Bible has these truths in it. I guess my point is just it's not written like a textbook, and it's not, how did God create the earth? Well, he spoke it. It doesn't necessarily go into all the different mechanisms with how these things work and so forth. And that wasn't the intention, other than God is behind it.
What I was trying to get to on that is that we can take it and we can use it for good, like you said, a tool. Or like the Egyptians were the first ones to invent it. There's a verse in Genesis that says they intended it to harm and God intended it for good. Well, you got to think science and like amputation and heart implants and all that stuff would have been really bad, big fails in the beginning, and it was just not good. But the learning curve of it, now it helps people. So now it's good. And that's what I was trying to say. That science can be good. It's, like you said, a tool. It just depends on how you look at it.
Absolutely. Yeah. Science is a tool. We don't have to shy away from it. Don't have to be scared of it. It works. It just does not replace God. It does not disprove God. There are a couple of interesting thoughts to me about it, and I don't want to spend a ton of time doing it. Mainly I want to kind of clarify what we're doing last week, but there are scientists in every field who they believe in God, they believe in the Bible, and they believe all the science actually points to it. Sometimes there are scientists who exist who kind of put science in a framework, so to speak. So, and what I mean by that is you say God cannot exist, therefore we do not look at God at all in our consideration of science, natural, physical world. Well, that's a framework. So you've eliminated things. You said this can only be the answer. This can only be the established parameters we can research in. And when you do that, it might be hard to see God when you've totally ruled him out as a possibility. But I will say you run into problems there, and you've probably all heard logical, somebody will propose a logical problem like, if God is all powerful, can he create a rock that he cannot lift? And that's supposed to be, and there are others like it, but it's supposed to be like, that it's a paradox, therefore God isn't real, let's move on, let's be, adults now. And that's an interesting question. It's just also kind of silly. And one thing that I think is also important to realize is if you remove God, those logical problems still exist in an atheistic viewpoint. Everything came from nothing. Nothing created everything. Life came from non-life. So, okay, you can make weird questions, hypotheticals all you want. Let's move on to that and let's just look at the facts of it. And then, there are things that science can't touch on. Have like goodness and love up there and stuff, but, they can't tell you where life came from. Where did first life originate? They can't do that. They might have an hypothesis. They can't test it in a lab or anything like that. And again, some of the experiments that have been conducted to see, in the early, setting conditions, how might RNA have combined with a protein to start leading toward DNA and so forth and like that. Well, when you start really looking at it, when they do that research, these scientists have intelligently designed the parameters of these things. They've set the conditions to precise moments. They've altered the RNA and protein to where it's easier to combine and reproduce. So in a way, they're almost proving intelligent design, which really just means God, the creator.
I say God can lift the rock. Like he can lift the rock. How did he write the Ten Commandments?
Oh, for sure. Well, yeah, it's just, yeah. You're right. I won't go on to the logical part. God is all powerful.
Also, God is spirit.
Yes.
He does not dwell. He does not live. He sent his Son to live on the earth. But lots of times we think in our mind of physical, earthly things, and God is the spirit.
Yeah, and really, to me, for a long time, I was like, I don't even care about the science stuff. You prove it, disprove it. Some parts of it work, some parts of it don't. There's some things in the Bible I don't completely understand. I don't understand, maybe why the earth looks as old as it does, and then, God created here. I don't really care. I can make it work in my head and move on with it. But to me, one of the bigger things is goodness itself. Science can't define that. It might can try to hypothesize why we have a notion of what is good. But it can't tell us what good is. It can't weigh it or measure it or identify it. And that's an interesting concept to me. Like physics. Did we create physics? Well, no. We kind of discovered how things work. Physics is like a universal kind of law, right? We understand it. Whether I understand it or not, physics is there. Physics works. Yeah. And I think the same is true with goodness in a sense. It's not just some concept like George Lucas conceptualized Star Wars. Well, that's an invention. He created it. He didn't discover it. He just created that with his own imagination. That's a different type of concept than physics. That's a different type of concept to me than goodness. Goodness is something real, and I think you have a lot of these physical laws, goodness, especially logic, or almost traits of God in a way that they exist, whether we fully understand them or not, whether we fully grasp them or not, and we perceive them and use them. And I think when you start looking at that, and then something that exists beyond the universe, almost has to, in a way. Anyways, I'm starting to fall into these other tangents again. This is a subject that you could have a series of classes on and write a series of books on. And that's not the intention here. I did want to touch on it. The main point I'm wanting us to make is you don't have to be scared of it when people talk about it, and you don't have to shy away from it from children. And I think it's okay to talk to them there are some scientists and there are some textbooks, that don't, consider God or anything spiritual or eternal in the least when they teach it and they come up with these conclusions. You don't have to shy away from that. Okay, they've arrived there. They've closed themselves off from that possibility, but there's holes in it when they do that. And then look, the Bible, exactly like you said, the Bible has scientific stuff in it. It's not contrary to science. It isn't. It might be contrary to some of the conclusions and ideas some scientists draw, but that's a different thing. And I just want us to know that when people use science, don't be scared of it. Don't shy away from it with your kids. And then, these don't have to fall victim to the white coat syndrome. Anyways, that's it. Hopefully I didn't make that more complicated. Joe, yes, sir.
Quick question, can science disprove the Bible?
No. Yeah. That's another great point. Yeah. It cannot disprove the Bible. Exactly. And again, yeah. And people will say that it does often. And it's just, well, you're just incorrect. You're being too generous with the term. You're almost trying to make these conclusions sound like the hard data, and they're not the same. So we use science as this broad general term, when really when we get into these conversations or read these papers, that's why I think it's important to understand what you mean by science at the time. Because you mean someone's conclusion, someone's opinion on data, okay, well that's different than the hard, fast stuff you actually measure and weigh on a scale. Does that make sense? Man, if I made things harder, email joshusthehut at gmail.com. Joshua the Hut. All right, sorry. Hopefully that was a clarification and didn't make things even more convoluted. So, back to Ecclesiastes. And previously in Ecclesiastes, it was a book written by Solomon. The book, I like it because it appears to be someone who feels lost, who is struggling, trying to understand life and stuff like that. And so it almost has this frantic kind of, back and forth trying to figure things out and understand it. But we saw last week that it's actually a pretty precise structure it was written under, these chiastic structures. So you can do it in the whole book, and you have these structures within structures throughout the book as it goes. It's not just a book of random musings by some lost individual. It does have a design, it does have a structure, and Solomon is writing it from the perspective of a place without God in order to draw us to a place with God. That is his ultimate intent. And if you want to know the conclusion, Ecclesiastes 12:13, fear God and keep his commandments. That's the whole duty of man. And in these first 3 chapters, we've seen, basically a life without God, vanity of vanities. All is vanity. Life is this vapor that's here for a moment and gone. You can't really hold on to it too much. You can't ever really fully grasp it. It's empty and hollow. Life is futile. Things go on and on and on. No matter what you do, you're not really going to have much significance in it. And even what you do, you're not going to find much profit in it. Wisdom is grief. Knowledge is sorrow. Accomplishment, it's ultimately empty because you're just going to die. And there's no escaping that. The wise man dies just like the foolish man. The human dies just like the animal dies. It's terrible. And so in verse 22 of chapter 3, Solomon kind of reaches a little conclusion. If you're just going to die anyways, you might as well, where he says, I perceive that there is nothing better than that a man should rejoice in his own works, for that is his portion. For who shall bring him to see what shall be after him? So if all this bad stuff's happening anyways, you might as well enjoy the fruit of your own labor. And so here in chapter 4, we start out, and he can't ever seem to hold on to any bright side for too long. As soon as he hits we can enjoy this, or this must be what we're tracking here, he gets here. So let's read verses 1 through 3, chapter 4. So I returned and considered all the oppressions that are done under the sun, and behold, the tears of such as were oppressed, and they had no comforter. And on the side of their oppressors there was power, but they had no comforter. Wherefore I praise the dead, which are already dead, more than the living, which are yet alive. Yea, better is he than both, which hath not yet been, who hath not seen the evil work that is done under heaven. So he's troubled that there is all this oppression in the world. He can't quite seem to make sense of it. And because it seemed to be so egregious and so terrible, he started almost envying the dead because they didn't have to experience it. They didn't have to witness any of these terrible things. God clearly does not like oppression. I do want to turn over to Proverbs 3 real fast, which again also Solomon wrote the Proverbs. I have verse 31 up there, but I want to begin earlier in verse 27, Proverbs 3. Withhold not good from them to whom it is due, when it is in your power and your hand to do it. Say not to thy neighbor, go and come again, and tomorrow I will give, when you have it by you. Devise not evil against thy neighbor, seeing he dwelleth securely by thee. Strive not with a man without cause, if he have done thee no harm. Envy thou not the oppressor, choose none of his ways. For the froward is abomination to the Lord, but his secrets is with the righteous. God and the Bible, are opposed to oppression, right? Good men should not envy oppressors, or shouldn't engage in it. If you value fairness, then act fair. And if you're being fair, then fairness exists in the world, even if you're the only one who's doing it. I want to take time to look at all these I have up there, though. And the thing is, like, oppression actually comes up again in the next chapter, and so we'll probably look at more passages that relate to oppression when we get there. But I'll go and look at these two. So Proverbs 11. In verse 1, a false balance is abomination to the Lord, but a just weight is his delight. It's kind of more talking about, fairness, honesty, that kind of thing, which does tie into oppression. In the New Testament, we can look at Romans 12. Yeah, 17 and 18, Romans 12, recompense no man evil for evil, provide things honest in the sight of all men, if it be possible, as such as lieth in you, live peaceably with all men. Right. And then 13, verse 7, render therefore all their dues, tribute to whom tribute is due, custom to whom custom, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor. Now, of course, if you know Romans 13, 1 through 7 there's primarily talking about governments, but I like referencing verse 7 because I think you can extend that obviously beyond government. If someone's due a tribute, you owe them a tribute. Someone's due a custom, you owe them a custom, and I think that's it. Is if someone you treat people fairly, regardless of their position. The government too, but I'm not as concerned about that, at least here in this context. The scriptures are interesting to me because, you apply it to yourself based on your perspective in the moment. And what I mean by that, there's passages about being hospitable, right? So you got to be hospitable. Elders need to be hospitable. You take care of those who need it, and so forth. And there's also passages like in Proverbs that say, withdraw your foot from your neighbor's house, lest he hates you. So it's like you don't over where you're welcome. Well, how do you apply those two passages? Am I supposed to be hospitable, or am I supposed to be whatever? It depends on, am I the host? If I am, I'm supposed to be hospitable. I shouldn't be sitting there with my guests, hey, wait a minute, you're supposed to be more thoughtful of me and you need to hurry up and go. You're staying a little too long. I don't need to worry about that when I'm the host. When I'm the guest, I don't need to be saying, hey, my host should be a more gracious host. He should be, refilling my drink a little more often or whatever. No, I need to be like, I don't need to be a hassle to my host. I need to be a gracious guest, and then I don't want to stay too long. It's probably better to leave early than to stay too late, right? And the same is true here with oppression. I've grown up in America. I like our history. Obviously there are parts about it that we don't like and don't like to think about, but you talk about the Revolutionary War, World War II. Man, I like those. I'm an American. I like the story of cowboys and stuff. I've never been one, but they sound neat, right? And so if someone's oppressing you or pushing down on you, man, I want to fight back. Take up arms. I'm an American. That's what I do. And that's probably one of the more obvious kind of approaches, But man, let's, if we're striving to become to be Christians, to be Christ-like, let's see what the Scripture talks about it. So if it's in our power to oppress someone, don't oppress them. Don't do it. Be fair. If you're being oppressed, persecuted, suffering unfairness, that sometimes is a different thing. I'm not saying maybe there are other circumstances, I'm not saying I'm going to let someone beat my children, well, whatever. But let's not ignore these passages that are talked about. Matthew 5. I want to add too in this context. I enlisted in the Army. I intentionally requested a combat job. This is a complicated matter, fighting, not fighting. It's not really what I'm talking about. So I just want to say that too. I'm not condemning anyone who fights or anyone, certain times self-defense and things like that. I feel like it's a complicated, nuanced issue. But if we're being persecuted, especially as a Christian, these verses absolutely apply, and we need to fully be aware of them and strive to meet them like Christ would want us to. So Matthew 5, beginning in verse 38. Ye have heard that it hath been said, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. But I say unto you, that you resist not evil. But whosoever shall smite you on thy right cheek, turn to him the other also. And if a man will sue thee at law, and take away thy coat, let him have thy cloak also. And whosoever shall compel thee to go a mile, go with him 2. Give to him that asketh thee, and to him that would borrow to thee, turn thou not away. Turning the other cheek, it's not easy, and I want to say it probably takes more strength to do that in a lot of cases than to fight back. Regardless, as a Christian, that is the expectation. If we look here in 1 Peter, and think what some of our early brethren had to endure, imagine these persecutions, of which are basically common knowledge, now, the actual persecution for worshiping God, for believing Jesus was the Son of God, and for confessing that, they had to endure all these horrible terrors that I think most of us have a hard time really imagining. But 1 Peter 2, so in the midst of all that, 1 Peter 2, so this 1 Peter 4 first, because I'd rather to re-say everything I was talking about. So persecutions. We've been in verse 12. Beloved, think it not strange concerning the fiery trial which is to try you, as though some strange thing happened to you. But rejoice, inasmuch as ye are partakers of Christ's sufferings, that when his glory shall be revealed, ye may be glad also with exceeding joy. If ye be reproached for the name of Christ, happy are ye, for the Spirit of glory and God rests upon you. In their part he is evil spoken of, but on your part he is glorified. But let none of you suffer as a murderer, or a thief, or as an evildoer, or as a busybody in other men's matters. If yet any man suffer as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God on his behalf. For the time has come that judgment must begin at the house of God, and it first begin with us, that we shall end be of them that obey not the gospel of God. And if the righteous scarcely be saved, where shall the ungodly and the sinner appear? Wherefore, let them that suffer according to the will of God commit the keeping of their souls to him and well-doing unto a faithful Creator. That is a pretty tall task, if you're suffering persecution for doing right, for pursuing goodness in Christ, to just suffer that with gladness is not easy. And I'm going to tell you that's a different type of gladness than you would enjoy a birthday cake or something like that, obviously. Now I want to go back to 1 Peter 2, because this is talking about oppression, like, servitude, slavery, and things like that. 1 Peter 2:18, servants, be subject to your masters with all fear, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the froward. How tough. How tough is that? Again, if you're a master or a boss, don't oppress anyone. Don't be awful. If you find yourself a servant, this is what's tough. Or an employee. You work just as well for your bad bosses as you do your good ones. And that's not easy. But, yeah. To me, this section reminds me of, the problem of evil. Everybody familiar with that term? Everybody heard that before? The problem of evil? It's a problem, if you didn't know. Evil's a problem. But there is this kind of philosophical notion, the problem of evil, and it troubles some people. Some people, it really bothers them. I think some people might use it as an excuse, to not do anything. Well, if God could do something about it, he would. Therefore, there is no God. I don't want to do anything. They're not really invested much in it. It's just a convenient excuse for them to ignore things. But I think some people are sincerely troubled by this, right? And so the problem of evil, it's basically the question of how to reconcile the existence of evil and suffering, with an all-powerful, all-good, all-knowing God, right? Why would God let these terrible things happen? And sometimes we'll say, God's not going to get in the way of, free will. So if someone wants to go murder someone else, God's not going to stop that person's free will. And that's just unfortunate. But the problem of evil isn't just what other people do to others. It's also, childhood cancer, A tornado jumps over a bar but lands on a kindergarten and kills a bunch of children. It's like, what sense does that even make, diseases and stuff like that. There's a lot of terrible things that happen on earth. Why? Why is there this suffering? It's one of the questions that Job asked, right? He didn't understand what he was going through. And what was he told? What did God tell Job?
Where were you when I created the world?
Yeah, he's like kind of like, you're not going to understand it, and I'm not going to tell you. You're just going to have to deal with it. And that is part of life. But, this life isn't it. It's not, it never was meant to be the end-all, be-all anyways. This isn't the goal. This is temporary. We're all going to die sooner or later. Most of us would rather it be later in good health and maybe pass on in our sleep. It just doesn't happen that way most of the time. It's unfortunate. There are unfortunate things that happen. We can go to Genesis 3 there with the fall of man, where Adam and Eve sinned, and then where things were better, but because of sin, things became harder. But again, this life was never meant to be eternal. It's never meant to go on forever anyways. And we're meant to rely on God with it too, and which is why the problem of evil, I think, is applicable here, because Solomon ends up kind of addressing the same idea, the same concept throughout the book of Ecclesiastes, and it bothers a lot of people today. It's still a prevalent kind of thing, and I think it's always going to be, always has, always will be. And the solution is kind of the same thing we get to with Solomon. Troy, do you have something?
Yeah, just a couple of things to clarify. One, the problem of evil, or why a benevolent God would allow evil to exist, is a huge question that, as a minister, I get all the time. And I always go to Genesis 1:31. It says, when God saw everything he made, and indeed it was very good.
Right.
So what God made was good. God made good. And you put up there Genesis 3. That's where the evil came from. That's where the problems came from. All the issues that we have is not from God. It's from our own choices and doing. And if anybody's honest with themselves, you can look back at the many things that happened, and you can see a human answer to why it happened.
Yeah, that's a excellent point. I feel bad I didn't have it on here before. Right, God made everything good. Genesis 1, exactly. And it's only in Genesis 3 when it was the opposition to that good. It was people working contrary to the things God had made or God's will that it kind of brought this fall, these terrible things. Yes, ma'am. I'm sorry.
And in all those bad things and bad situations and circumstances and places and things that we may enter into, we have to remember that we bring the light of God, and that we are commanded to let our light so shine before men that God may be glorified.
Absolutely. Yeah, we're supposed to provide that light. And God sent his own son to suffer. A cruel, unfair demise. God, Jesus, took that on himself to do that. And we can sit and debate on whether it made more sense or do this or that or whatever. That's what happened. And then bad things are going to happen. And that's the interesting thing about this too, of the problem of evil. Therefore, no God. It struggles my faith, so I'm not going to believe in God. Well, you've changed nothing in your life. You still go through a life where there's going to be terror and suffering and hardship, but now you've got no hope at the back end of it. You're just going to suffer and you're going to die and it's going to be over. You're as miserable as Solomon, and that is exactly the point of this book. I'll rep through these real fast. Matthew 5:45, he makes the sun to rise on the evil and on the good and sends the rain on the just and the unjust. It just happens. And if we get ahead here to Ecclesiastes 11:11, we'll see that too, where, and I actually really love that verse. I'm just going to read it. I really like it. And we'll hit it again when we get to chapter 11. But always like this verse anyways. So many, I feel like, applications to it. So in Ecclesiastes 11:11, Solomon says, I returned and saw under the sun that the race is not to the swift, or the battle to the strong, neither yet bread to the wise, or riches to men of understanding, nor yet favor to men of skill, but time and chance happens to all of them. And I like that because generally you think, obviously, the fastest runner is always going to win the race. The strongest guy is going to win the fight or the battle. And so on like that. And that's just not always the case. If it was, there'd be no point in having the competition, right? And we generally like even stories of like the underdog kind of winning. That guy, you shouldn't have won, but you did. How'd that happen? It's kind of neat. And sometimes those things can happen where it's not neat. You can have someone who appears to be very righteous, who've lived a very, selfless, humble life devoted to God, and they might suffer some terrible health calamity way before their time. Sometimes things just don't seem to make sense. A perfectly healthy child can all of a sudden fall terribly ill and suffer greatly, and then not recover from it. These are terrible things. They're just part of life. It's unfortunate. But this life isn't it. We're headed towards something else.
Josh,
Sir.
what you have 11:11. There is no 11:11.
What verse did I just read? I said it. I even looked at it. 9:11. I'm so sorry. 9:11.
I wasn't correcting you. I just wanted to find it.
No, you read it wrong on my board. It's 9:11. Sorry about that. Where was I? I'm totally lost now. Man, what happened here? No. It's all me. 9:11. Yeah, I wrote it up there wrong and everything. Yeah, anyways, 9/11. Thank you, Doug. Appreciate that. Time and chance, I like the idea of like middle school perspectives, Everybody been in like middle school or junior high, right? High school, I guess you could pick any grade that you want to, right? But you were younger, you weren't quite an adult, but you're enduring something probably. Is anyone here not like encountered anything during like those younger formative years where you felt like, oh man, this is really rough? You had a moment in your life where this is awful. Like, I don't know how I'm ever going to get beyond this point. This is the worst thing ever. I'm not going to survive this. And then when you graduate middle school or high school, whatever it is, you look back and like, oh, that was kind of dumb. That was a middle school perspective. I understand better now I'm in high school or I'm in college or whatever. I'm past it. I've understood it now that I've graduated. And part of me wonders if things like that in this life will be this way to us when we graduated this life. So I don't understand these things now. I don't understand why children suffer terribly. I just know that it happens. But maybe I feel like once we've graduated from this life onto the next one, things will be in that perspective again. Like, oh, yeah, okay. And I understand better. Right. It wasn't a big deal. I mean, part of the reason I think these middle school problems end up being small is because they were such a finite moment of time. And then when you've got on to the rest of your life, this bigger concept, you can put it in its proper context. That was a small little thing. It was rough in the moment, but I look back now like no big deal. I got over it. Everybody else is going to get over it too. You just move on. I think these things will look like that to us when we are looking at it from the perspective of eternity, especially if we're there with God, if that makes sense. Makes sense to me, maybe it can to you too. And again, I think the same perspective of this problem of evil, and it sincerely troubles a lot of people. It's the same thing that appears to be troubling Solomon, but there is a conclusion. It's one of the reasons Solomon kind of brings it up, because he's again taking us from here And he'll start to find like, okay, well maybe this is a part of life that I can enjoy, but then he finds that it's meaningless too, and he eventually brings us on to nothing really is going to make complete sense when you remove God from the perspective. And then when you put God in the equation as the focus, things tend to make a little bit more sense. You're not going to understand everything, and your life isn't going to be, peaches and cream the rest of your life. But you have a hope of what's next. You have redemption, you have salvation, these things afforded to you. All right, so anything else on that? If not, I'm going to move on here. That was only 3 verses. All right, verse 4 through 6. Again, I considered all travail and every right work, that for this a man envied of his neighbor. This is also vanity and vexation of spirit, or striving for the wind. The fool foldeth his hands together and eateth his own flesh. Better is a handful with quietness than both the hands full with travail and vexation of spirit. I am open to anyone else's ideas of the interpretation of these passages. To me, I read these verses and I think that this first verse, it's like, people will look at what this hard worker, this guy who's worked and scraped by all the time, all the stuff he's accumulated, he's got wealth, he's got a nice house and this and that, he's built all this stuff for him. People envy the stuff. They don't really think too much about the work put into it. And you have the next passage here, he kind of folds his hand together and eats his own flesh. He's kind of wasting away. Envy kind of becomes a thing. Work usually goes into that stuff, and he follows it up here with verse 6. Better is a handful of quietness than both hands full with travail and vexation of spirit. Well, what's he talking about here? To me, if you get that idea, you want stuff, you can work real hard and get stuff. And if stuff, money, whatever, becomes kind of like your goal, you end up, and there are people, I think we probably know some people who work so much just to keep accumulating that stuff. And it's like, okay, well, you've got 2 hands full of junk. That's great. But man, you got all this stress and travail and other stuff with it. Is it worth it? When you could have maybe 1 handful, which is still adequate, but have, I don't know, be able to sleep at night and maybe have some relationships and stuff. I think that's the idea that's going on here. Now, verse 8 to me looks kind of like a transitional verse between this idea and then what's coming next. But let me just read 7 through 12. Then I returned and I saw vanity under the sun. There is one alone, and there is not a second. Yea, he hath neither child nor brother, yet is there no end to all of his labor. Neither is his eye satisfied with riches. Neither saith he, for whom do I labor, and bereave my soul of this good? This also is vanity. Yes, a sore travail. There are two are better than one, because they have a good reward for their labor. For if they fall, one will lift up his fellow. But woe to him that is alone when he falls, for he has not another to help him up. Again, if 2 lie together, then they have heat. But how can one be warm alone? And if one prevail against him, 2 shall withstand him. A 3-fold cord is not quickly broken. Again, 8 is this transitional kind of verse. It's talking about this materialism and gathering wealth, but then it's saying, but there are people who work so hard for this stuff that they don't have any relationships, they don't have any children or anything to share it with. And so we're like, well, what good is all your junk then? You don't have anybody. And then in the following verses, he talks about how good it is to have relationships, to have companionship, children, a spouse, friends, things like that. I have heard here, so, verse 12, a 3-fold cord is not quickly broken. I like the imagery there. I actually heard someone say that they thought this was Solomon talking about marriage, husband, wife, God. But I like the idea. I don't think that's really what he's talking about specifically here. Ecclesiastes, we'll get into marriage later on. We'll address that probably more when we get to it. But here I think the most straightforward reading is just kind of strength in numbers. That you're better off with people. And then if we think about the church, there are certain things we need to do together. The term church itself, ecclesia, means assembly. can't really assemble by yourself. You know what I mean? You're already kind of assembled for the most part. You know, you need the assembly people together. Yeah, I guess we'll stop there. Any last points or questions? Anything on there? Man, again, if you have any questions or complaints or suggestions, anything else, Joshua the Hut, 2 T's, @gmail.com, or call me. And yeah, we'll hit it then. So we'll pick up there next week. Thank you.